Have you ever wondered why a small strip of land, barely visible on most world maps, became one of the most contested territories in European history? Denmark looks unreal not because of towering mountains or endless deserts, but because it exists where it shouldn't. A fragile threshold between seas, a gateway that every empire wanted to control. This is a nation built on sand dunes that move, cliffs that collapse, and bridges that defy water itself. For centuries, Denmark's geography made it invaluable. Today, that same landscape reveals what happens when strategic position becomes both gift and burden. Welcome to Denmark. This is more than a kingdom. It's a coastline that shaped empires. Not every center of power is built where geography demands it. Some emerge from compromise, others from accident. But Christiansborg Palace sits exactly where control required it, on a small island in Copenhagen's heart, where a fortress built in 1167 first claimed dominion over the narrow strait between Denmark and Sweden. This is not just a royal residence, it houses Denmark's parliament, Supreme Court, and Prime Minister's office within the same Baroque walls. Three branches of power occupy one structure, a concentration of governance rare in any democracy. The palace sits where Copenhagen began, at a point that made it a target. Fire destroyed earlier versions in 1794 and 1884. Each time, the structure was rebuilt, more elaborate than before, not out of vanity, but necessity. Control of this location meant control of the sound, and control of the sound meant taxing every ship that passed between the Baltic and the North Sea. For over 400 years, Denmark collected sound dues from foreign vessels, a toll that financed the kingdom and made enemies of nearly every maritime power in Europe. Sweden invaded multiple times. Britain bombarded Copenhagen in 1807, destroying much of the city to prevent Denmark from siding with Napoleon. The palace that stands today was completed in 1928, its neoclassical facade, a statement of stability after centuries of conflict. Now, political debates inside Christiansborg often center on Denmark's role in a changing Europe. Questions about immigration, Greenland's autonomy, and the balance between Nordic cooperation and national sovereignty. The palace that once symbolized control of a strait now represents a smaller nation navigating alliances it no longer dominates. The building endures, but the power it holds has transformed. world sees a bridge connecting two countries. But beneath that image lies a narrower truth. For 800 years, this 4-kilometer stretch of water divided kingdoms that wanted the same thing: control of passage between the Baltic and the North Sea. The Øresund Bridge, completed in 2000, spans what Sweden and Denmark once fought wars to possess. It links two nations whose histories are written in the shifting borders of this exact strait. The sound is shallow, cold, and deceptively calm. Beneath the surface, complex currents flow between the Baltic Sea and the Kattegat, a mixing zone where salinity shifts and ecosystems collide. For medieval traders, navigating this passage meant paying Denmark's sound dues, a toll enforced by cannons from Kronborg Castle in Helsingør. Sweden, sitting just across the water, built its own fortresses in response. The two kingdoms clashed repeatedly, borders shifting with each treaty and war. By the 19th century, international pressure forced Denmark to abolish the sound dues in 1857, ending a lucrative monopoly. The strait remained a barrier until the bridge transformed it into a corridor. Today, over 19,000 vehicles cross daily, carrying workers, goods, and students between two integrated economies. The Øresund region functions as a single labor market, erasing a border that once required naval power to maintain. Climate change now threatens this connection differently. Rising sea levels and increasing storm surges put pressure on both the bridge's tunnel section and Copenhagen's low-lying infrastructure. The same narrow geography that made Denmark powerful is now a vulnerability, as coastal cities adapt to a future where controlling the water may mean surviving it. Some towns exist because rivers meet roads. Others because hills offer defense. Ribe exists because merchants needed a port where the Wadden Sea's tides could reach inland Denmark, even though that location floods with seasonal regularity and sits on marshland barely 2 meters above sea level. Founded around 700 CE, it became Denmark's oldest town, not despite its geography, but because of what could be traded across it. The town's medieval layout remains largely intact, a grid of narrow streets designed to channel wind and water away from timber-framed houses. For over a millennium, Ribe's economy depended on managing the wetlands, draining fields, reinforcing dikes, and adapting to the rhythm of tides. The cathedral, built in the 12th century, stands on the highest ground available, a limestone foundation that offers minimal protection from storm surges. Ribe's importance declined as larger ports developed, but its geographic challenges persisted. In 1634, a storm surge known as the Burchardie flood devastated the region, killing thousands and reshaping the coastline. The town survived, but its relationship with water became one of constant negotiation. Modern Ribe maintains dikes and pumping stations, infrastructure that previous generations couldn't afford. Today, Ribe faces a different kind of pressure. Tourism brings visitors drawn to its preserved medieval character, but the town's survival still depends on water management. Climate projections show increased flooding risks, a threat that centuries of adaptation can mitigate but not eliminate. The same flatness that made Ribe a trading hub now makes it a case study in coastal resilience. Every year, the cliffs grow shorter. Not by much, sometimes only centimeters, occasionally meters, when winter storms trigger landslides. But the process never stops. Møns Klint, rising 128 meters above the Baltic Sea, is not a monument of stability. It is white chalk, compressed from 70 million years of marine fossils, and it has been collapsing since the glaciers that pushed it upward retreated. What appears solid is actually in slow dissolution, a geological process visible within a human lifetime. The cliffs formed when Denmark was submerged beneath a shallow sea, accumulating layers of calcium carbonate from countless microscopic organisms. Later, glaciers pushed these deposits upward during the last ice age, tilting and folding the chalk into its current configuration. The result is a cross-section of deep time, exposed and crumbling. For centuries, locals extracted flint from the beach, using it for tools and trade. The cliffs themselves were a landmark for Baltic navigation, visible from far offshore. In the 19th century, Romantic painters depicted them as symbols of Danish national identity, tying geology to cultural mythology. That imagery persists even as the cliffs continue to retreat. Modern Denmark protects Møns Klint as a nature reserve, but protection doesn't stop erosion. Heavy rains and winter storms accelerate the rate of collapse, sometimes triggering landslides that close coastal paths. In 2007, a major section fell, altering the cliff profile overnight. The cliffs are managed, monitored, and fenced, but they cannot be stabilized without fundamentally changing what they are. Climate change intensifies the cycle. Increased rainfall saturates the chalk, while rising sea levels undercut the base. Møns Klint is disappearing, not dramatically, but measurably. The same process that formed it continues to unmake it, a reminder that Denmark's landscapes are not fixed, but transient. The world sees a photograph, two seas meeting but not mixing, a visible line dividing the Skagerrak from the Kattegat. Visitors walk to the tip of Grenen and stand between the North Sea and the Baltic, witnessing water that refuses to blend. But that image hides what the currents actually do. They build and destroy this narrow spit of sand constantly, shifting its position with every storm, rewriting maps with each decade. This is not a stable meeting point. Grenen extends, retracts, and migrates, depending on opposing currents that deposit sand and sweep it away. What exists today will not match maps from 10 years ago. Coastal engineers monitor it, but do not intervene. Grenen is left to its own processes. For centuries, this location was a graveyard for ships. The convergence of currents created unpredictable waves and hidden sandbars. Skagen developed as a fishing village precisely because wrecks were common, providing salvage opportunities alongside traditional fishing. By the 19th century, lighthouses and better navigation reduced the danger, but the seas remained unforgiving. Painters of the Skagen school settled here in the late 1800s, drawn to the unique light created by the meeting of two bodies of water. They depicted fishermen, dunes, and the endless horizon, romanticizing a landscape that was harsh and economically marginal. Today, tourism sustains Skagen, visitors arriving to witness the sea's division. Climate change affects Grenen indirectly. Altered storm patterns shift sediment flows, potentially accelerating the spit's migration. The phenomenon itself will persist, but its exact location remains unpredictable, shaped by forces larger than Denmark's narrow coastline. In 1900, a lighthouse was built 200 meters from the cliff edge. By 2019, it stood 6 meters away, half buried in migrating sand and tilting toward the sea. Engineers moved the entire structure 80 meters inland, not to save it permanently, but to buy time. Because on this coast, time is measured in erosion rates, and permanence is a concept that doesn't apply. The landscape moves, and everything built upon it eventually yields. The headland is defined by sand, coastal dunes that rise shift, and bury whatever stands in their path. Rubjerg Knude is layered glacial deposits capped by sandy soil, vulnerable to both wind and wave erosion. The cliffs lose 1 to 2 meters per year, a rate that varies with storm intensity but never stops. In the early 20th century, attempts were made to stabilize the dunes with vegetation and fencing. The efforts failed. Sand overwhelmed the lighthouse keepers' residences, forcing abandonment in 1968. The lighthouse itself became a ruin, half buried, its purpose obsolete. Rather than dismantle it, Denmark left it to fate until public pressure and engineering ambition led to the 2019 relocation. The move was not preservation in the traditional sense. It was an acknowledgement that Denmark's coastline is transient and that structures built here must eventually yield. The lighthouse now functions as a visitor attraction, a monument to both human ingenuity and the limits of permanence. Climate change accelerates the processes already at work. Rising sea levels increase wave energy at the cliff base, while altered precipitation patterns affect dune stability. Rubjerg Knude will continue its migration inland, pulled apart by wind and water, a landscape in constant revision. Not every landscape is natural in the way wilderness is supposed to be. Some are created by human error and perpetuated by physics. Råbjerg Mile is a migrating dune system, one of the largest in Europe, moving northeast at 15 meters per year. It began in the 16th century, when overgrazing and deforestation destabilized coastal sands. Once mobilized, the dune became self-sustaining, a geological consequence of poor land management that now moves across roads, farmland, and forest as if none of it matters. For centuries, Råbjerg Mile buried farms and settlements. In the 18th century, the village of Christiansborg was abandoned as sand encroached. The church was relocated stone by stone to higher ground. The dune continued its march, indifferent to human effort. By the 19th century, attempts to halt it with tree planting and sand fences had largely failed. Modern Denmark treats Råbjerg Mile as a protected natural area, a rare example of active dune migration in Northern Europe. Visitors walk across its ridges, experiencing a landscape that feels desert-like, alien to Denmark's typical agricultural flatness. The dune's movement is monitored, its trajectory predictable, Within a range, it will eventually reach the coast and disperse into the sea. Climate change may alter this timeline. Shifting wind patterns could change the dune's speed or direction, while coastal erosion might accelerate its dissolution. For now, Råbjerg Mile remains a reminder that Denmark's landscapes are not geologically stable and that human impact on the environment can persist for centuries. Denmark is not built for cliffs. Most of its coast is sand and soft chalk, eroding steadily into the North Sea. So when a vertical limestone outcrop rises 47 meters above the water on Jutland's northwest shore, it exists as an anomaly, a harder stone that outlasted everything around it. Bulbjerg is Denmark's only bird cliff, formed 63 million years ago from Bryozoan limestone, more resistant to erosion but still retreating, slowly, predictably, year by year. The cliff provides nesting sites for seabirds, particularly kittiwakes, whose colonies cling to narrow ledges during breeding season. This is rare in Denmark, a country with few vertical coastal features. Bulbjerg exists as a geological outlier, a remnant of rock that refused to disappear as quickly as its surroundings. Historically, the cliff served as a navigation landmark for ships traveling along Jutland's western coast. Its visibility made it strategically useful, though its rocky shoreline prevented safe harbor. Local communities used the area for grazing, but the cliff itself remained largely unmodified, too steep to farm, too isolated to develop. In the 20th century, limestone quarrying began nearby, exploiting the same geological formation that created Bulbjerg. The quarry expanded until conservation efforts in the 1982 halted further extraction, protecting the bird colonies and the cliff's structural integrity. The quarry remains, a scar in the landscape, while the cliff continues its natural erosion. Today, Bulbjerg faces pressure from both tourism and climate. Increased visitor traffic degrades the clifftop vegetation, while rising sea levels and stronger storms accelerate the base's erosion. The seabird populations fluctuate, affected by changes in North Sea fish stocks and temperatures. Bulbjerg endures, but on a diminishing foundation. Most of Denmark is built on limestone and sediment deposited by ancient seas. Bornholm is not. It is Precambrian granite, over 1.7 billion years old, an island of bedrock in a sea of softer stone. Geologically, it has nothing in common with the rest of the country. Politically, it has been fought over precisely because it didn't fit too far east, too exposed, too strategically positioned between Sweden, Poland, and the Baltic trade routes. Sweden occupied Bornholm repeatedly during the 17th century wars, using it as a Baltic stronghold. After World War II, Soviet forces liberated it from German occupation, but delayed withdrawal, creating brief tension before returning it to Denmark in 1946. Even now, Bornholm's isolation makes it strategically significant, a Danish outpost closer to Poland and Sweden than to Copenhagen. Bornholm's economy has shifted across centuries, from fishing and farming to granite quarrying, then to ceramics and glasswork, and now heavily toward tourism. The island's round churches, built in the 12th century as both worship spaces and fortifications, reflect a history of vulnerability. Their thick walls and elevated gun slots were practical, not symbolic. Modern Bornholm contends with demographic decline. Young people leave for education and employment on the mainland, leaving an aging population and vacant properties. The Danish government incentivizes relocation, but the island's distance from economic centers persists as a structural challenge. Climate change affects Bornholm differently than the mainland. Its rocky coasts erode more slowly than Denmark's sandy shores, but the island's water supply depends on limited aquifers, vulnerable to saltwater intrusion as sea levels rise. Bornholm's granite foundation makes it geologically stable, but not immune to the pressures facing all of Denmark's fragmented geography. The Faroe Islands are not Denmark. Geologically, they are volcanic basalt, formed 55 million years ago, halfway between Iceland and Norway. Culturally, they speak their own language and maintain distinct traditions. Politically, they govern most of their own affairs. Yet they remain within the Kingdom of Denmark, a relationship rooted in Norse colonization, the Kalmar Union, and centuries of administrative control that neither side has fully disentangled from. The landscape is defined by basalt cliffs rising directly from the Atlantic, treeless slopes covered in grass, and weather so severe that wind speeds regularly exceed 100 kilometers per hour. "18 islands are inhabited, their villages clustered in narrow valleys and coastal inlets, accessible by tunnels blasted through mountains or ferries navigating rough seas. On Vaga Island, Mulafossa waterfall drops from the edge of a cliff straight into the ocean, a visual symbol of the island's verticality and exposure. The waterfall exists because the island's interior drains toward its edges, where erosion has carved the land into sharp profiles. This is not gentle countryside, it is geology in confrontation with the Atlantic. For centuries, the Faroese survived on fishing, sheep farming, and seabird hunting, economies shaped entirely by isolation and scarcity. During World War II, British forces occupied the islands, severing ties with Nazi-occupied Denmark and accelerating a sense of separate identity. After the war, debates over independence intensified, but economic dependency on fishing rights and Danish subsidies complicated separation. Today, the Faroe Islands face a unique tension. A growing independence movement seeks full sovereignty, yet the island's economy remains vulnerable to fluctuating fish stocks and climate-driven changes in marine ecosystems. Warming Atlantic waters push fish species northward, altering the foundations of Faroese livelihood. The connection to Denmark is both historical artifact and ongoing negotiation. The islands are part of the kingdom, but not the European Union, maintaining control over fisheries while relying on Copenhagen for financial stability. Mulafossa and the cliffs that surround it are not metaphors, they are the physical reality of a place that exists on edges, where land meets ocean and autonomy meets dependence. Denmark looks unreal because it is a landscape that should not have mattered as much as it did. A flat country with no mountains, no vast resources, no natural defenses, yet it controlled one of Europe's most valuable choke points for centuries. The cliffs crumble, the dunes migrate, and the coasts retreat, but the geographic position remains. What made Denmark powerful was not the land itself, but where it was placed. And now, in an era of rising seas and shifting borders, that same position asks a different question. Not how to control the water, but how to live with it. If you think Denmark feels unreal, wait until you see the places where ice still decides the future.